Special forces visited a single dad's food truck, but when they saw his name engraved on their classified honor wall, every soldier dropped their tray because the man cooking burgers was supposed to be dead. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted Maple Hollow's town square in warm golden hues. Eli Brooks stood at the window of his food truck, stars and sandwiches, wiping down the stainless steel counter with practiced motions. His weathered hands moved methodically, the same way they had every morning for the past 3 years. "Daddy, can I put the flags up today?" 9-year-old Maddie bounced on her toes, holding their collection of small American flags. Her brown pigtails swayed with her excitement. "Sure thing, sweetheart." Eli's smile softened his rugged features. "Just remember, I know, with made, town, done, made, any, made, I know. Maddie grinned. "Treat the flag with respect. Never let it touch the ground." She carefully began arranging the flags along the service window, her small fingers working with surprising precision. The scent of smoking hickory wood filled the air as Eli checked on the meat he'd started at dawn. The pork shoulder had been cooking low and slow, just the way his customers liked it. He'd learned long ago that good barbecue, like most things worth doing, couldn't be rushed. "Morning, Eli." The cheerful voice belonged to Mary Jenkins, their first regular customer of the day. "Smells like heaven over here." "Morning, Miss Mary." Eli nodded, already reaching for a fresh bun. "The usual? You know it. And maybe an extra for Tom at the hardware store." She leaned against the counter, watching as he assembled her sandwich with careful attention. "You're still coming to the Veterans Fair this weekend, right? The committee's counting on stars and sandwiches being there." "Wouldn't miss it." Eli topped the pulled pork with just the right amount of his signature sauce. Already cleared the calendar. By mid-morning, the line stretched halfway down the block. Eli worked steadily, each sandwich crafted with the same care as the first. Maddie helped by handing out napkins and taking orders, her cheerful chatter making everyone smile. "Here comes Miss Grace," Maddie announced excitedly, waving at the approaching figure. Grace Thompson walked toward the truck, her arms full of what looked like fresh-baked cookies. Her dark hair was swept back in a neat bun, and her warm brown eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. "Thought my favorite helpers might need a mid-morning boost." "You're gonna spoil us, Grace," Eli said, but his eyes showed his appreciation. "That's what friends are for." Grace set the cookies on the counter, then turned to Maddie. "And how's my junior baker doing today?" "Great. Daddy let me put up all the flags by myself." Maddie beamed proudly. Grace helped at the church food pantry just down the street, and over the past year she'd become a steady presence in their lives. Her gentle kindness reminded Eli of better times, though he tried not to dwell on such thoughts. "The Veterans Fair Committee is thrilled you're participating," Grace mentioned, accepting the coffee Eli handed her. "They're expecting quite a turnout this year." "Just doing my part," Eli replied quietly. "Figure it's the least I can do." "You do more than most," Grace assured him. "The way you help those veterans who come through. It matters, Eli." He nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. The lunch rush was starting, and the line grew longer. Grace squeezed Maddie's shoulder before heading back to the pantry, promising to check in later. Throughout the afternoon, Eli served up sandwiches and conversation. He knew most of his customers by name, the regulars who'd supported him when he'd first arrived in Maple Hollow with nothing but a broken-down food truck and a grieving daughter. Old Jim Palmer came by for his daily sandwich, settling into his usual spot on the bench nearby. "Lost everything in the war myself," he often told newcomers. "But look at Eli here. Man rebuilt himself from scratch. Shows what you can do with faith and hard work." Eli never corrected these assumptions about his past. Let them think he just had a rough deployment. The truth was far more complicated. As the sun began to set, Eli started his closing routine. Maddie helped clean up, humming as she worked. The evening light caught the small framed photograph mounted inside the truck, a soldier in desert camo, standing tall and proud. The inscription below read, Captain E. Brooks, KIA, 2014. Maddie had gone to fetch her backpack from inside when Eli paused in front of the photo. His fingers brushed the frame lightly. "Guess I'm still serving, huh?" he whispered to the fading light. The evening settled over Maple Hollow like a gentle blanket, stars beginning to twinkle above the town square. The smell of barbecue lingered in the air, mixing with 35, the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms from the courthouse garden. Another day done, another step forward in the quiet life he'd built from the ashes of his old one. Saturday morning arrived with perfect fair weather, casting cheerful sunshine across the Maple Hollow town square. American flags snapped in the gentle breeze, their colors bright against the clear blue sky. The Veterans Charity Fair had transformed the usually quiet space into a bustling celebration with red, white, and blue bunting draped across booth canopies and patriotic music floating from the central stage. Eli Brooks carefully maneuvered his Stars and Sandwiches food truck into position near the stage. The truck's freshly polished exterior gleamed, its own American flag waving proudly from the serving window. He'd spent extra time that morning ensuring everything was spotless, knowing many veterans would be attending. "Perfect spot, Daddy," Maddie called from the passenger seat, her face beaming. She wore her special fair outfit, a red and white striped dress with blue ribbons in her hair that Grace had helped her pick out. As they set up, Grace Thompson appeared carrying a large basket of homemade cookies. Her warm smile brightened her face as she approached the truck. "Thought you might want something sweet to go with those sandwiches today," she said, setting the basket on the counter. "You're too kind, Grace," Eli replied, accepting the basket with a grateful nod. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, though something deeper, almost sad, lingered in their depths. The fair crowd grew steadily throughout the morning. Maddie proved herself an excellent helper, carefully wrapping each sandwich in paper printed with small American flags, while Grace organized the orders and handled the money box. The three of them worked in comfortable sync, with Eli at the grill crafting his signature barbecue sandwiches. "Best sandwich in Tennessee," declared Mayor Wilson, taking a big bite. A line of customers nodded in agreement, the savory smoke drawing more people toward the truck. Around noon, a rumble of engines drew everyone's attention. A convoy of military vehicles rolled into the fairgrounds. 3 olive-drab Humvees and 2 transport trucks, all bearing Veteran Support Tour magnetic signs. Special Forces veterans in civilian clothes but wearing unit caps emerged, spreading through the fair to interact with the crowd. "Look at all the soldiers, Daddy," Maddie exclaimed, standing on her tiptoes to see better. Eli's shoulders tensed slightly, but he kept his movement steady as he worked the grill. "Remember, honey, veterans. They're veterans now." A group of the newly arrived men made their way toward Stars and Sandwiches, drawn by the appetizing smell and growing crowd. Among them was a broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair, who introduced himself as Sergeant Duke Wallace. "3 of your finest, brother," Wallace said with an easy grin. "Whatever's making that amazing smell." Eli nodded and turned to prepare the order while Maddie proudly took Wallace's money, carefully counting out his change. The sergeant leaned against the counter, casually glancing around the truck's interior. His eyes fell on the framed photograph mounted on the back wall, the memorial photo of a soldier in full dress uniform. Wallace's smile vanished. He stared at the photo, then at Eli, then back at the photo. His hand gripped the counter edge so hard, his knuckles went white. "Colonel," he called out, voice tight. "Colonel Harris, sir! You need to see this!" A tall, distinguished-looking officer broke away from the crowd and approached the truck. His bearing spoke of decades of command, though he wore civilian clothes like the others. Wallace pointed to the memorial photo, and Colonel Harris studied it intently. "Captain E. Brooks," Harris read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of authority, even in its softness. "KIA, 2014. The Colonel's sharp eyes swept from the photo to Eli, who had stopped moving at the grill. The sizzle of cooking meat filled the sudden silence between them. Interesting. Harris continued, his tone measured and careful. That name appears on a very particular wall, a classified one, in a secure wing of the Pentagon. Grace glanced between them, sensing the rising tension. She gently guided Maddie to help another customer, moving her away from the exchange. Harris leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "You shouldn't exist, Captain Brooks." The spatula in Eli's hand clattered to the counter. He stared at Harris, all color draining from his face, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the grill. Around them, the fair continued its cheerful bustle. But for Eli, all sound seemed to fade away, leaving only the pounding of his heart in his ears. Later that afternoon, the fair's cheerful commotion felt distant behind Eli's food truck. The aroma of barbecue lingered in the air as Colonel Harris and 3 other veterans approached him in the shadows of the oak trees. Through a gap between the booths, Eli could see Maddie's pink dress as she helped Grace arrange craft supplies, both of them laughing in the sunshine. "We need to talk, Captain," Harris said quietly, his weathered face serious beneath his Veterans Organization cap. Eli wiped his hands on his apron, his movements deliberately slow. "Not much to talk about," he said, but his voice held a slight tremor. Sergeant Wallace stepped forward. "Your old call sign was Shepherd 1. The mission was Operation Silent Dawn." Eli's shoulders tensed. Those words hadn't been spoken aloud in years. 3rd week of March, 2014. Another veteran added, "Kandahar Province. You led a 4-man team in to stop." Eli's word came out sharp, like breaking glass. He glanced again toward Maddie, still safely distant. "Not here." Harris nodded to the others, and they formed a tight circle behind the truck, shielding their conversation from curious eyes. The carnival music seemed to fade away as Eli's mind pulled him back to that night. The desert air had been cold, stars scattered like broken glass across the Afghan sky. Radio chatter crackled with coded coordinates. His team moved silent as shadows through a narrow valley, tracking high-value intelligence. Everything had gone according to plan, until the explosion. Eli whispered, pulling himself back to the present. "Someone knew we were coming. The intel was compromised." Harris's face showed recognition. "We found parts of your gear. Blood. No bodies. After 3 days of searching, they had to call it." Eli finished. "Listed us all as KIA. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The searing heat, the impact throwing him clear, waking alone in a village elder's home with broken ribs and a concussion. By then, his death was already official. "But you survived," Wallace said, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you come back?" Eli leaned against his truck, suddenly feeling the weight of all his hidden years. "Because I learned the truth. The mission wasn't compromised by the enemy. It came from our side. Someone high up sold us out." The veterans exchanged dark looks. Harris cursed softly. "They buried the mission deep," Eli continued. "Classified it beyond reach. My death became part of the cover-up. Coming back would have," he swallowed hard, "would have put others at risk, the rest of my team's families. So I stayed. Gone." "For 8 years?" Wallace asked. Eli's eyes found Maddie again. She was holding up a sparkly craft project to show Grace, her face glowing with pride. "Sarah, my wife, she knew I was alive. We had a contact system. When Maddie was born, I'd get messages, photos." His voice roughened. "Then Sarah got sick, cancer, and suddenly I had a choice. Stay dead and let my little girl grow up an orphan, or come back as someone new." Harris finished quietly. Eli nodded. "Changed my papers. Became just another veteran starting over. Bought the food truck." He gestured to his simple kingdom of steel and smoke. "It's not much, but it's a life," Harris said. A good one. I came back for my little girl, Eli said, his voice breaking slightly. Not for me. She needed her father more than the world needed another dead hero. The veteran stood silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of his story. Finally, Harris stepped closer, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. Pride and concern warred in his expression. Listen to me carefully, he said in a low voice. What happened that night? There are still people in power who want it buried. If your name surfaces again, if anyone starts asking questions, he glanced meaningfully toward Maddie. It could reopen old wounds, dangerous ones. Eli straightened, squaring his shoulders with the same quiet strength that had once led men into battle. Now it protected something far more precious. The battle, peaceful life he'd built from the ashes of his old one. The sound of Maddie's laughter floated across the fairground, clear as a bell above the music and chatter. Behind his food truck, 5 soldiers, 1 officially dead, 4 still carrying his memory, stood in a circle of shared understanding. Some burdens, they knew, were heavier than metals. Some courage showed itself not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet choice to keep going, one day at a time. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Eli's modest ranch house on the outskirts of Maple Hollow. At the kitchen table, Maddie hunched over her math homework, her pencil tapping against the page as she worked through fraction problems. Eli stood at the counter, holding an unopened envelope from the Veterans Affairs office that had been tucked away in his desk drawer for months. The paper felt heavy in his hands. He ran his thumb across the official seal, remembering the day he'd first seen it and couldn't bring himself to break it open. The letter represented everything he'd left behind, or rather, everything that had been taken from him. Dad? Maddie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Can you help me with this problem? Sure, sweetheart. Eli tucked the envelope into his back pocket and pulled up a chair beside her. The familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo helped ground him in the present moment. What are we working on? 3/4 plus 2/3. She wrinkled her nose. The denominators are different. As he helped her find a common denominator, his mind wandered to his own calculations. From years ago, the careful math of building a new identity. The fake Social Security card had cost him nearly all his emergency cash. The driver's license came from a contact who'd sworn never to reveal its origin. Each piece of his new life had been meticulously planned, down to the backstory about moving from Oregon after his wife's passing. The doorbell chimed, making him jump slightly. Through the window, he saw Grace Thompson's familiar silhouette on the porch, holding what looked like a pie dish. I'll get it. Maddie bounced up from her chair. When she opened the door, the smell of fresh-baked apple pie wafted through the house. Grace stepped in, her warm smile lighting up the room. I thought you two might like some dessert. It's still warm. You're the best, Miss Grace. Maddie hugged her around the waist. Eli got up to help Grace with her coat. You didn't have to do this. Oh, please. Baking helps me think. Grace set the pie on the counter. Her eyes met his, and he saw the gentle concern there. And after today at the fair, I thought you might need a friend. Maddie was already getting plates from the cabinet. Can I have a big piece, Dad? Finish your math first, kiddo. He ruffled her hair as she returned to her homework with renewed determination. Grace leaned against the counter, her voice low. The veteran seemed to know you. Eli busied himself with the coffee maker. From a long time ago. Must be hard, carrying around old memories like that. She didn't push, but her presence felt like a safe harbor in a storm. Some memories. He measured out the coffee grounds carefully. Some memories are better left buried. Grace touched his arm lightly. Nothing stays buried forever, Eli, and maybe it shouldn't. He looked at her then, saw the understanding in her eyes. She'd lost her husband in combat too. Only her loss was official, recognized, honored. His was a ghost story, a classified file gathering dust in some Pentagon basement. They shared the pie in comfortable silence, watching Maddie finish her homework. Grace left shortly after, but her words stayed with him long into the night. The next morning, Eli arrived at his usual spot downtown to set up the food truck. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when he noticed something different. People were already gathering, more than usual for this early hour. They stood in small clusters, glancing his way and talking in hushed tones. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop approached first. "My nephew's in the army," she said, beaming. "He called last night. Told me about those Special Forces soldiers recognizing you yesterday. Said you must be quite something." Eli's stomach tightened. "Just serving food, ma'am. That's all." But more people were arriving. Mr. Patterson from the hardware store, the Roberts twins who ran the diner down the street. Each carried that same look of curiosity and admiration. "That's him," he heard someone whisper. "The one the Special Forces guys recognized." The morning breeze caught the American flag mounted on his truck, making it snap and flutter. Eli watched it wave, remembering another flag, the one they draped over his empty casket at Arlington, the one his wife had accepted with tears while he watched from shadows, unable to reach out and comfort her. The small crowd continued to grow, their whispers carrying on the wind. His carefully constructed anonymity was slipping away like morning fog, and there wasn't a thing he could do to stop it. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing at the truck. "That's the hero everyone's talking about." Eli turned away, pretending to check his supplies. Through the serving window, he could see his reflection in the steel equipment, a man caught between two worlds, neither fully dead nor truly alive. The flag above his truck continued to wave, marking the end of his quiet existence in Maple Hollow. The bell above Joe's diner chimed as Eli pushed through the glass door. The morning rush had ended, leaving only a few regulars scattered among the red vinyl booths. Colonel Harris sat in the far corner, his back straight and shoulders squared despite wearing civilian clothes. A cup of black coffee sat untouched before him. "Thanks for meeting me," Harris said as Eli slid into the booth. His voice was low, meant only for Eli's ears. Couldn't exactly say no after yesterday. Eli managed a weak smile as Sally, the waitress, approached with her coffee pot. "Need a refill, Colonel?" she asked. Harris shook his head, and she turned to Eli. "The usual, hun?" "Just coffee today, Sally." "Thanks." Once she'd moved away, Harris leaned forward. The morning light from the window cast harsh shadows across his weathered face. "We need to talk about what happens next." "Nothing happens next," Eli said firmly. "I've built a life here, my daughter. That's exactly why we need to talk." Harris glanced around the diner before continuing. "The mission that got you declared KIA? That wasn't just a tactical failure. There were people high up who wanted certain things buried, people who still have power." Eli's coffee arrived, and he wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "It's been 9 years. Some secrets don't have expiration dates." Harris's fingers drummed once on the table. "The fact that you're alive, it raises questions. They'd rather stayed buried." "I'm just a food truck owner now. Nobody cares about. Someone already knows you're here." Harris's words stopped Eli cold. "After the fair yesterday, I made some calls. There were inquiries about Captain Brooks's file last month, digital fingerprints that shouldn't exist." The coffee turned bitter in Eli's mouth. "You think they found me?" "I think you need to be prepared." Harris pulled out his wallet and laid a business card face down on the table. "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you call this number, day or night." Eli stared at the card but didn't touch it. "I can't run again. Maddie has friends here. School. I'm not suggesting you run." Harris's voice softened. "But you need to be careful. Watch for unusual patterns. Strange cars. Anyone asking too many questions." The morning sun caught the silver in Harris's hair, reminding Eli how much time had passed since Afghanistan. They'd both been younger then, certain of their place in the world. Later that afternoon, Eli worked mechanically at his food truck, his mind elsewhere as he assembled sandwiches. The usual crowds came and went, but he barely registered their faces. Grace Thompson appeared around 2 o'clock, her gentle presence a stark contrast to the morning's tension. "You seem troubled today," she said softly, leaning against the truck's counter. Eli managed a wan smile. "That obvious?" "To someone who knows what to look for." She tilted her head. "Want to talk about it?" "Not really sure I can." He focused on slicing tomatoes, each cut precise and measured. Grace nodded, accepting his answer without pushing. "Mind if I pray with you?" The knife paused mid-slice. In all his years of hiding, prayer had been his constant companion, the one thing that couldn't be taken from him. He set the knife down and nodded. Grace reached across the counter and took his hand. Her words were simple but heartfelt. "Lord, we don't always understand your path for us, but we trust in your protection and guidance. Give strength to those carrying heavy burdens, and remind them they're not alone. Amen." "Amen," Eli whispered, squeezing her hand once before letting go. The afternoon light was fading when Maddie came bounding up to the truck after school. She had paint on her fingers from art class and a thoughtful look in her eyes. "Daddy?" she asked, helping him wipe down the counters. "Were you a hero? Before, I mean?" The question caught him off guard. He set down his cleaning cloth and knelt to meet her eyes. "What makes you ask that?" "Those soldiers yesterday. They looked at you like you were special." She twisted her paint-stained fingers together. "And I heard Mrs. Peterson telling someone you were a hero." Eli's throat tightened. How do you explain war and sacrifice to a 9-year-old? How do you tell her that sometimes survival feels more like guilt than heroism? "I wasn't a hero, sweetheart," he said finally, smoothing her hair. "Just someone who came home by God's mercy." Maddie considered this, then wrapped her arms around his neck. "I think you're still special." The simple faith in her voice nearly undid him. He held her close, breathing in the scent of school craft supplies and strawberry shampoo, reminding himself why he'd chosen this life. As night settled over Maple Hollow, Eli went through his closing routine. The streets were quiet except for crickets and the occasional passing car. He checked the truck's locks once, then again, his fingers lingering on the cold metal. Harris's warning echoed in his mind. A pair of headlights appeared at the end of the street, moving slowly. Too slowly. The vehicle, a dark sedan, crawled past his truck and continued down the road. But instead of turning at the intersection, it idled there for several long moments before finally driving away. Eli stood motionless in the darkness, the weight of Harris's business card heavy in his pocket. The crickets chirped on, oblivious to how quickly peace could shatter. The church bells of Maple Hollow First Baptist rang clear and sweet across the town square, their bronze tones echoing off storefronts still closed for Sunday morning. Eli Brooks sat in a back pew, tugging slightly at his collar. It had been years since he'd worn a tie. Beside him, Maddie bounced excitedly in her flowered dress, while Grace Thompson sat on his other side, her presence calm and reassuring. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden floors. The familiar scent of old hymnals and lemon polish brought back memories of his childhood church. Eli watched as the sanctuary filled with familiar faces from town. Customers who visited his food truck, veterans he'd served, neighbors who waved as they passed his house. Pastor Mike stepped to the pulpit, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile as he opened his Bible. "Today's message," he began, "comes from Matthew 5:15. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house." Eli felt his throat tighten. Maddie leaned against his arm, drawing pictures on the back of the bulletin with her colored pencils. Grace's hand found his briefly, a gentle squeeze of understanding. "God doesn't give us gifts to hide them," Pastor Mike continued. his voice carrying to the rafters. He doesn't preserve us through trials just to keep us in shadows. When he saves us, when he protects us, it's because he has a purpose, a light meant to shine. The words seemed to pierce straight through Eli's chest. He thought of his food truck, the memorial photo, the years spent looking over his shoulder. What if all this time, his survival hadn't been just about protection, but purpose? After the final hymn, the congregation spilled out onto the sun-warmed steps. Maddie ran ahead to join the other children, chasing each other across the lawn, her laughter carrying on the breeze. "The sermon really spoke to you today, didn't it?" Grace asked softly, standing beside him in the dappled shade of an old oak tree. Eli nodded, watching his daughter play. "Made me think, maybe I've been looking at everything wrong. All this time, I thought staying hidden was the only way to keep what matters safe." "Speaking of keeping things," Grace said, her eyes twinkling, "we're having our monthly veterans breakfast next Sunday. The usual cook is down with a bad knee. That food truck of yours would be perfect. Grace Thompson, are you trying to volunteer me?" Eli's mouth quirked into a half smile. "Just suggesting that maybe it's time to let your light shine a little brighter." She touched his arm gently. "Those men and women who come, they need more than just breakfast. They need to see someone who understands, someone who made it through the dark times." Eli was quiet for a moment, watching the flag in front of the church ripple in the preparate breeze. "You know what? You're right. If God kept me alive through everything, the mission, the years after, he must have meant for me to really live, not just exist." Later that afternoon, Colonel Harris's truck pulled into Eli's driveway. The older man's face was thoughtful as they sat on the front porch, watching the clouds drift overhead. "I've been thinking about what you said at the diner," Harris began, his fingers wrapped around a glass of iced tea. "About wanting to move forward." "And?" Eli asked. "I made some calls. Carefully. There are people, good people, in positions to verify what really happened that day, to back up your story." Harris set his glass down. "It won't be quick, and it won't be easy, but if you're ready to step into the light, I've got your six." Eli felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I'm ready. For Maddie. For myself. For all the other soldiers who need to know there's hope on the other side of darkness." That evening, Eli knelt beside Maddie's bed, tucking her worn teddy bear under the quilt beside her. Her room glowed softly in the light of her star-shaped nightlight, casting gentle shadows on the walls covered with her drawings. "Daddy?" she asked sleepily, her small hand finding his. "Pastor Mike said we shouldn't hide our lights. Does that mean you don't need to hide anymore?" Eli felt tears prick at his eyes as he smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "No, baby. Not anymore." Through her bedroom window, he could see the American flag on their front porch, its stripes and stars moving gently in the evening breeze against the backdrop of a sky just beginning to fill with stars. For the first time in years, the sight didn't fill him with sadness or fear, only hope. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Hollow's Main Street as Eli wiped down the counter of his food truck. A small stack of local newspapers sat beside the register, each featuring the same headline: "Mystery Military Hero Serves Up Hope in Small Town." He picked one up, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he read the article about himself. "Dad, look." Maddie bounced up to the window, holding her phone. "We're getting so many likes on the food truck page." Her eyes sparkled with excitement. "People are sharing your story everywhere." Eli managed a small smile, though his stomach tightened. The article had gone up yesterday, and already the quiet routine he'd carefully built was transforming. A line had formed outside Stars and Sandwiches before they'd even opened, twice as long as usual. "Could really use some help today, sweetie," he said, tying his apron. "Think you can handle the register?" "You know I can." Maddie beamed, sliding into her spot with practiced ease. By noon, the crowd had swelled beyond anything they'd seen before. People drove from neighboring towns, some just to shake his hand. Eli kept his head down, focusing on the calm work, slicing meat, toasting bread, mixing his signature sauce. But he couldn't miss the whispers of admiration or the grateful nods from fellow veterans. "Order up," he called, sliding another sandwich across the counter. The customer, an elderly man wearing a Korean War veteran cap, gripped his hand firmly. "Thank you for your service, son," he said, eyes misty, both then and now. Grace Thompson appeared around lunchtime, bearing fresh baked cookies as always. But today she rolled up her sleeves and jumped in to help, without being asked. Her quiet efficiency and warm smile helped steady Eli's nerves as the crowd continued to grow. "You're going to need real help soon," she observed, organizing takeout boxes. This isn't slowing down. She was right. By mid-afternoon, Eli had hired 2 local high school students, Jenny Martinez and Tommy Cooper, showing them the basics while trying to keep up with orders. They were quick learners, eager to help, and their youthful energy lightened the intensity of the day. "Mr. Brooks," Jenny said, carefully wrapping another sandwich, "my dad was in the Army too. He says you're a real hero." Eli paused, spatula mid-flip. "Just trying to serve good food, that's all." But the town had already decided he was more than that. People left generous tips, shared their own military stories, or simply thanked him with tears in their eyes. The local hardware store owner dropped off a new American flag for his truck. The mayor stopped by to shake his hand. Through it all, Maddie glowed with pride. Happier than Eli had seen her in years. She chatted easily with customers, no longer carrying the weight of their shared secret. During a quiet moment, Grace caught Eli watching his daughter. "She needed this too, you know," Grace said softly, "to see her father standing tall." Eli nodded, throat tight. "I just hope." He started but was interrupted by Colonel Harris appearing at the window. "Got a minute?" Harris asked, his expression carefully neutral. They stepped away from the truck, moving toward the shade of a nearby oak tree. Harris wore civilian clothes but stood with military precision, hands clasped behind his back. "Your name's trending on local social media," he said without preamble. "The article's being shared in veteran groups across 3 states. Eli ran a hand through his hair. "I know, it's good press. Clean press. But it's visible press." Harris cut in. "If your name's trending, others will notice too. People who'd prefer the past stay buried." Before Eli could respond, Maddie's voice rang out. "Daddy, we need more buns!" "Coming, sweetheart." He turned back to Harris. "I hear you, Colonel, but I can't hide anymore. Not from my daughter, not from myself." Harris nodded slowly. "Just stay alert and call me if anything feels off." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of orders and handshakes. Jenny and Tommy proved to be natural helpers, and by closing time, stars and sandwiches had served more customers than any day in its history. "That was amazing," Maddie exclaimed, counting the day's receipts. "Can Jenny and Tommy come back tomorrow?" "We'll see," Eli smiled, watching Grace help the teens clean up. Her presence throughout the day had anchored him, her quiet strength a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. As the sun set, they said goodbye to the teens and Grace. Maddie went to get their jackets from inside the truck, while Eli did one final check of the equipment. The street had quieted, most shops already closed for the night. That's when he saw it. A black SUV parked halfway down the block, its windows tinted dark. Eli's muscles tensed instinctively as he studied the vehicle, old training kicking in. When Maddie emerged from the truck, he casually positioned himself between her and the SUV. "Ready to head home?" he asked, forcing lightness into his voice. "Yep. Can we have pizza tonight? I'm too tired to cook." Eli reached for his keys, glancing back toward the SUV. In the few seconds he'd looked away, it had disappeared, leaving only empty space and lingering unease. The street looked exactly as it always did, peaceful, normal, safe. But Eli knew better than most how quickly normal could change. He locked up the truck, double-checking each latch. The evening air had cooled, carrying the sweet scent of nearby magnolia trees. All around them, Maple Hollow settled into its quiet routine. But beneath the surface of this successful day, beneath the pride and celebration, a familiar tension had taken root. The morning sun had barely climbed over the horizon when Colonel Harris's truck pulled into the shelter's parking lot. Duke Wallace followed close behind in his beat-up Chevy, both vehicles carrying groups of veterans ready to help. Eli's food truck was already there, the smell of cooking meat and fresh bread drifting through the early morning air. "Need a hand, Captain?" Duke called out, pulling on an apron with an American flag printed on it. His broad smile was infectious. "Always room for more helpers," Eli replied, passing him a stack of paper plates. Maddie sat at a folding table nearby, carefully arranging plastic forks and napkins. The shelter's doors opened at 7, and soon a line formed. Men and women of all ages waited patiently, many wearing old military caps or jackets that had seen better days. Colonel Harris worked the line, greeting each person with dignity and respect. "Marines?" he asked one elderly man who stood especially straight despite his worn clothes. "Yes, sir. 68 to 72, the man replied, his chin lifting with pride. "Thank you for your service, brother." Harris clasped his hand firmly. "Let's get you some breakfast." Inside the truck, Eli worked with practiced efficiency. But his movements were different today. There was a lightness to his steps that hadn't been there before. Having his old comrades around seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders. During a quiet moment, Eli and Harris found themselves alone by the coffee station. Steam rose from their cups as they watched Duke entertaining some veterans with wild stories from their deployment days. "I should have gone back," Eli said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "After I recovered, I should have found a way to let them know." Harris shook his head. "You had orders to stay dark, and a baby daughter who'd just lost her mother." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Survival isn't betrayal, Eli. Sometimes it's the hardest mission of all." Eli's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "The guys we lost that day would be proud to see you now," Harris finished firmly. "Serving others, raising that beautiful girl of yours, that's honoring their sacrifice." Duke joined them, wiping his hands on his apron. "Speaking of honor," he said in a lower voice, "we've been talking. Me and the colonel, we've got connections. People who owe us favors. We can get those old mission files declassified." Harris nodded. "It'll take time, but we can prove what really happened. Clear your name properly." Eli looked between his old friends, throat tight with gratitude. "You'd do that?" "Brother, we do a lot more than that," Duke said, clapping him on the shoulder. "No man left behind, even if it takes years to bring him home." The morning passed. Quickly after that, by early afternoon, they'd served over 200 meals. Maddie had charmed everyone with her cheerful spirit, and even the most withdrawn veterans had smiled at her innocent questions about their service. Later that evening, Eli and Maddie stood on Grace's front porch. The modest house was well kept, with flowers blooming in window boxes and a porch swing that creaked gently in the breeze. "Come on in," Grace welcomed them warmly. "Hope you like lasagna." The inside of her home felt lived in and comfortable. Family photos lined the walls, and a cross-stitched Bible verse hung in the entryway. "Be strong and courageous." During dinner, Maddie dominated the conversation, telling Grace about helping at the shelter and how many people had thanked her dad. Grace listened with genuine interest, her eyes occasionally meeting Eli's across the table with understanding. The meal was simple but delicious. Afterward, Maddie curled up on the couch with a book Grace had given her, leaving the adults to clean up. They worked in comfortable silence, Eli washing while Grace dried. The routine felt natural, as if they'd done this many times before. In the living room, they could hear Maddie's soft giggling at something in her book. Eli's eyes caught on a photograph on the kitchen windowsill. A young Marine in dress blues smiled out from the frame, his face eerily similar to the expressions Eli had seen in his own unit. That mix of pride and innocence before war changed everything. Grace noticed his gaze. She picked up another plate, her movements slowing. "Different wars," she said softly. "Same scars." Eli met her eyes, seeing in them the same shadows he carried. They shared a look of perfect understanding. No words needed between two people who knew the cost of service and sacrifice. The morning sun painted Maple Hollow's town square in warm golden light. American flags fluttered from every lamppost, and red, white, and blue bunting draped the small wooden stage. The smell of barbecue and fresh-baked pies filled the air as townspeople bustled about, setting up chairs and tables for the community fair. Grace Thompson stood on her tiptoes, carefully pinning up a string of patriotic pennants across the stage. Her gentle face glowed with determination as she worked. 9-year-old Maddie Brooks handed her another thumbtack from a small container, beaming with excitement. "Is Daddy really going to be up here on stage?" Maddie asked, bouncing on her heels. Grace smiled down at her. "He sure is, sweetheart. Your father deserves this recognition more than anyone." Across the square, Eli Brooks watched the preparations from inside his Stars and Sandwiches food truck. His weathered hands gripped the counter tightly as doubt crept into his mind. After years of living in the shadows, the thought of standing in the spotlight made his heart race. Colonel Harris approached the truck, his familiar steady presence bringing calm. "You doing all right there, Brooks?" Eli managed a weak smile. "Just feels strange, sir. Being seen." "You've earned this," Harris said firmly. "More than earned it." He glanced around before lowering his voice. "Got something special planned for today. That service medal of yours, the one lost in the chaos? We found it." Eli's eyes widened. "How did you—" "Let's just say, I know some people who owed me favors," Harris replied with a slight grin. "It's time you wore it again, Captain." Throughout the morning, more people arrived. Veterans in pressed uniforms mingled with families carrying picnic baskets. Children ran between the booths, waving small flags. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation and joy. A local news van pulled up, and a reporter with perfectly styled hair stepped out, followed by a cameraman lugging equipment. Eli watched them nervously from his truck window. Grace appeared beside him, touching his arm gently. "You don't have to do any interviews if you don't want to," she assured him. "This is your day. You decide how much to share." Eli nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Grace, for everything." Their eyes met briefly, and something warm passed between them. By early afternoon, the square was packed. Eli's food truck had a line stretching around the corner, but today he wasn't alone behind the counter. Other local restaurants had volunteered to help serve, letting him participate in the ceremony. Maddie sat on the stage steps, swinging her legs as she watched the crowd. She wore her best dress, navy blue with white stars, and her dark hair was neatly braided. Grace had helped her get ready that morning, and now the little girl practically glowed with pride. "Look at all these people," Maddie said as Eli approached. "They're all here for you, Daddy." Eli knelt beside her, straightening her collar. "They're here for all our veterans, Sweet Pea, for everyone who served." "But especially you," she insisted, hugging him tight. The ceremony began as the sun started its descent, painting the sky in brilliant orange and pink. Colonel Harris took the stage first, his commanding presence hushing the crowd. He spoke about sacrifice, honor, and the bonds between soldiers that never break. Eli stood at the bottom of the stage steps, his heart pounding. He wore a simple dark suit, borrowed from Grace's brother, and his hands fidgeted at his sides. Grace stood nearby, offering silent support with her presence. "And now," Harris announced, his voice carrying across the square, It is my profound honor to present a hero who was lost to us, but by God's grace has returned. A man who exemplifies the very best of what it means to serve, both in uniform and out. Captain Eli Brooks. The crowd erupted in applause as Eli climbed the steps. Camera flashes sparkled through the evening air. He caught sight of Maddie's beaming face in the front row, seated between Grace and some of his regular customers from the food truck. Harris turned to face him, holding a small velvet box. "Captain Brooks," he said formally, though his eyes were warm with emotion. "This medal was thought lost with you. Today we return it to its rightful owner." He opened the box, revealing the gleaming service medal inside. Eli's throat tightened as Harris pinned it to his lapel. The weight of it felt familiar, like coming home after a long journey. The applause grew louder, and someone started chanting USA until the whole crowd joined in. Looking out over the sea of faces, friends, neighbors, fellow veterans, Eli felt decades of tension finally begin to release. Maddie bounced up and down, clapping wildly. Grace wiped tears from her eyes while maintaining her gentle smile. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the square, Eli stood at the edge of the stage. The TV crew packed up their equipment, and families began gathering their belongings. The big banner above the stage caught the last rays of sunlight. "Heroes Among Us honoring Captain Eli Brooks." Eli tilted his face toward the darkening sky, watching the first stars appear. "Maybe I was meant to come home for this," he whispered to himself, feeling a deep peace settle in his heart. Morning sunlight streamed across Maple Hollow's town square, warming the crisp autumn air. Hundreds of chairs filled the grass, nearly all occupied by townspeople dressed in their Sunday best. Children waved small American flags, their faces painted with stars and stripes. The wooden stage, draped in patriotic bunting, stood ready for the fair's closing ceremony. Eli Brooks sat behind the stage, his hands clasped tightly. In his lap, his usually pristine food truck uniform had been replaced with a pressed dark suit that Grace had helped him choose. Maddie, wearing her favorite blue dress with white ribbons in her hair, couldn't stop fidgeting beside him. "You look handsome, Daddy," she whispered, straightening his tie for the third time. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. Colonel Harris approached, his medals gleaming in the morning light. "Almost time, Captain." He squeezed Eli's shoulder. "You ready?" Eli nodded, though his throat felt tight. Grace appeared with a glass of water, her kind eyes meeting his. "Just speak from your heart," she said softly. The mayor's voice boomed through the speakers, welcoming everyone to the ceremony. The crowd's eager chatter subsided as he began introducing Eli. Time seemed to slow as Eli walked up the wooden steps to the stage, each footfall echoing in his ears. Standing at the podium, Eli looked out over the sea of familiar faces, his neighbors, his customers, his friends. People who had accepted him without knowing his full story, who had shown him what community truly meant. "I never planned to speak publicly again," Eli began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "For years, I lived in shadows, believing that's where I belonged. But God had other plans." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Sometimes the hardest part of surviving isn't the battle itself, it's learning to live again afterward. The crowd listened intently as Eli spoke about faith sustaining him through dark times, about finding forgiveness, not just for others, but for himself, about the blessing of second chances, represented by every person who visited his food truck, every veteran who shared their story, every smile from his daughter. "This town," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "taught me that being a hero isn't about the battles you fight. It's about getting up each morning and choosing to serve others, to love your neighbor, to believe in something bigger than yourself." From the front row, Maddie beamed up at him, holding tight to Grace's hand. Grace wiped away tears, nodding encouragingly. Colonel Harris stepped forward, carrying a velvet box. The other veterans lined up behind him, standing at attention. "Captain Eli Brooks, Harris announced formally. "It is my honor to present you with a medal that should have been yours years ago." He opened the box, revealing the gleaming silver medal. "For valor, above and beyond the call of duty." Eli bowed his head as Harris draped the medal around his neck. The weight of it felt both foreign and familiar, like greeting an old friend. The crowd erupted in cheers, many rising to their feet. "Captain Brooks! Captain Brooks!" they chanted. Maddie jumped up and down, tears streaming down her face. "That's my daddy," she called out proudly. Grace wrapped an arm around the little girl's shoulders, her own eyes glistening. Eli raised the medal, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. Sunlight caught the silver surface, sending sparkles across the crowd. For one perfect moment, everything felt right in his world. But at the edge of his vision, he saw Colonel Harris, tense. Following his gaze, Eli noticed two men in dark suits standing at the perimeter of the field. They moved with purposeful steps toward the stage, their expressions grim. The cheering continued as the men reached the steps. One flashed a badge so quickly Eli barely caught the federal seal. "Captain Brooks," the taller agent said, his voice cutting through the celebration like ice. "You're coming with us." The crowd's joy transformed into confused murmurs. Eli felt the medal grow heavy against his chest as reality crashed back in. "Daddy!" Maddie's scream pierced the sudden silence. She tried to run forward, but Grace held her back, horror etched across her face. The truth Eli had feared was finally catching up with him, right when he dared to believe in the light. The black SUVs, tires crunched over gravel as federal agents guided Eli Brooks toward the waiting vehicle. His wrists burned against the cold metal of the handcuffs, but his face remained composed. A soldier's discipline even now. Behind him, the festive decorations of the town fair seemed to mock the moment's darkness. "Daddy!" Maddie's cry pierced the hushed crowd. She struggled against Grace Thompson's protective embrace, tears streaming down her small face. The medal that should have been pinned to Eli's chest lay forgotten in the grass. Grace held Maddie close, her own eyes glistening but her voice steady. "We'll bring him home, sweetheart. I promise." She pressed her lips to the top of Maddie's head, watching helplessly as the car door closed behind Eli. Colonel Harris stepped forward, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "This isn't over, Brooks." His words carried across the square, meant as much for the agents as for Eli. "Your brothers have your back." The SUV pulled away, leaving only dust and shocked silence. The townspeople stood frozen, their flags and banners hanging limp in the still air. Duke Wallace cursed under his breath, his fists clenched at his sides. Hours later, Eli sat in a stark interrogation room, the fluorescent lights harsh against institutional gray walls. His handcuffs clinked against the metal table as he shifted in his uncomfortable chair. Two men in dark suits faced him, Agent Roberts and Agent Chen, they'd said, though Eli doubted those were their real names. "Let's go through this again, Mr. Brooks," Roberts said, his voice carrying practiced neutrality. "You've been living under an assumed identity since 2014, collecting income, interacting with federal agencies under false pretenses." "My name is Captain Eli Brooks," Eli responded quietly. "Everything in my food truck permit applications was true." Chen slapped a file onto the table. "You're listed as killed in action. Dead men don't run food trucks or raise daughters, Captain." "I was following orders," Eli said. "After the mission went wrong, the mission is classified," Roberts cut in sharply. "By discussing it publicly, you've compromised national security." Eli leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I never discussed mission details. I only acknowledged who I am." Meanwhile, in Maple Hollow, Colonel Harris sat in his temporary office at the local Veterans Center. Phone pressed to his ear. Maps and files covered his desk, evidence gathered over years, waiting for this moment. "Listen carefully, Senator," he said, his voice low and determined. I've got documentation proving the original cover-up. Captain Brooks was following direct orders when he went dark. The real threat to national security isn't him, it's the people who buried the truth. Across town, Duke Wallace worked his own angles, calling in favors from fellow veterans. "We need those declassified files from 14, he growled into his phone. "Brooks saved half our unit that day. Time to return." The favor. Grace Thompson stood in her church's community room, now transformed into an impromptu command center. Dozens of townspeople crowded around tables, writing letters, making calls, posting on social media. Number "Bring Ellie Home" trended locally, then regionally. Remember, Grace instructed the volunteers, her quiet strength carrying through the room. Keep it respectful. Focus on his service, his character, his role in our community. She glanced at the wall where children had posted drawings of Eli's food truck, decorated with hearts and stars. At home that night, Grace helped Maddie with her bedtime routine, trying to maintain normalcy in a world suddenly turned upside down. "Dear God," Maddie prayed, her voice trembling but determined, "please bring my daddy home. He's a good man, and he helps people, and I need him. Amen." She looked up at Grace with eyes too old for her years. God hears us. Right, Miss Grace? Grace gathered Maddie close, her heart aching. "He always does, sweetheart. Always." Days blurred together in federal custody. Eli's cell was small but clean, better than some places he'd slept during his service. He sat on the narrow bed, holding a wrinkled photograph the agents had allowed him to keep. Maddie's smile beamed up at him, captured at last year's 4th of July celebration. The fluorescent lights began their nightly dimming sequence. Eli touched Maddie's face in the photo with gentle fingers, his throat tight. "If this is my last fight, Lord," he whispered into the gathering darkness, "let it be for her." A tear slipped down his cheek, falling onto the photograph as the cell plunged into shadow. Through it all, the words of his final prayer hung in the air. A father's love defying steel bars and government walls, reaching across the miles toward his daughter's matching tears. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Hollow's town square as Grace Thompson stood at the base of the gazebo steps, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded a piece of paper. Around her, dozens of townspeople gathered, holding handmade signs that caught the early light. "Bring Eli home and honor the truth" stood out in bold letters against white poster board. "We're here today," Grace began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "because one of our own needs us. Eli Brooks served this country with honor, survived against impossible odds, and came home to be the kind of father and neighbor we all admire." Maddie stood beside her, clutching a small American flag. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed sleepless nights. But she held her head high, just like her father would have wanted. Grace squeezed the girl's shoulder before continuing. "For 5 days now, he's been held without proper cause. This isn't justice. This is fear, trying to silence truth." Local news cameras captured the scene as more people joined the gathering. Miss Betty from the diner. Mr. Wilson, the hardware store owner. Even Principal Martinez had closed the school for the morning so teachers could attend. They formed a circle around the gazebo, their presence a quiet testament to small-town solidarity. Channel 4 News reporter Sarah Chen held her microphone steady, speaking into the camera. "Behind me, the citizens of Maple Hollow continue their peaceful protest for decorated veteran Eli Brooks. What began as a local story has now captured national attention." Grace watched as people shared photos and videos on their phones. The hashtag number Honor Ellie Brooks appeared on screen after screen, spreading like ripples in a pond. Veterans from Seattle to Miami posted their own stories of serving with Eli, each account adding weight to his character. "Ma'am," a young soldier in dress uniform approached Grace. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan, never met Captain Brooks, but my CO says he saved an entire village once. We're with you." He handed her a stack of letters from his place. Unit. By noon, the crowd had swelled to fill the square. Food trucks, competitors of Eli's who'd become friends, provided free meals to protesters. Children ran between adults' legs, waving smaller versions of the signs their parents held. The atmosphere was both solemn and hopeful, like a prayer made visible. Colonel Harris arrived as the afternoon sun beat down on the pavement. His civilian clothes couldn't hide his military bearing, but today there was something different about him. A nervous energy that seemed foreign to his usual calm demeanor. He pulled Grace aside, speaking in low tones. "I did something that might cost me my pension," he said, running a hand through his silver hair. "But I couldn't let them bury the truth again." Grace's heart quickened. "What did you do?" "Sent files to Washington. Proof that Eli was following direct orders when everything went sideways. Evidence showing who really betrayed the mission. Names that go high up the chain of command." He looked around cautiously. "People who thought their secrets died with Eli's supposed death." "Will it help?" Grace asked, hope warring with worry in her voice. "It has to. These documents prove Eli was made a scapegoat. They tried to silence him by declaring him dead, but God had other plans." Harris's voice cracked slightly. "He's a better man than any of those who betrayed him." The protest continued into evening, lit by candles and cell phone lights. News vans lined Main Street, broadcasting live updates. Social media exploded with support. Videos of veterans saluting, civilians sharing Eli's food truck stories, and countless messages demanding justice. A retired general in Texas posted, "I've seen the mission files. Captain Brooks deserves a medal, not handcuffs." Number Honor Ellie Brooks, a Marine unit in California, shared a photo of their own food truck gathering. "Standing with our brother. Truth can't stay buried." Grace's phone buzzed constantly with messages from across the Clare country. People offering legal help, veterans promising to testify, families wanting to contribute to Maddie's care. The outpouring overwhelmed her, each message a reminder that light could pierce even the darkest circumstances. As stars began appearing in the purple Tennessee sky, Grace's cell phone rang. She recognized the Washington, D.C. area code and stepped away from the crowd, her heart pounding. Maddie watched her with wide eyes as she answered. The voice on the other end was crisp. "Official. Mrs. Thompson, this is regarding the Eli Brooks case." Grace steadied herself against the gazebo railing, listening intently. Tears began rolling down her cheeks as the official spoke. When the call ended, her legs gave way, and she sank to her knees on the worn wooden steps. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The crowd gathered closer. Waiting, Maddie pressed against her side, hope and fear warring in her young face. Around them, the square fell silent. The candles flickered in the evening breeze. News cameras turned toward Grace as she raised her tear-stained face to address the crowd. Eli's case was being reviewed in Washington. The truth was finally coming to light. The austere halls of the federal building in Washington, D.C. echoed with each footstep as Eli Brooks walked between two security officers. His gray suit, hastily purchased the day before, hung slightly loose on his frame. After days in custody, dark circles rimmed his eyes, but his posture remained military straight, shoulders squared against whatever lay ahead. Through tall windows, morning sunlight streamed across the marble floors, creating patterns that reminded him of the desert, a thought he quickly pushed away. He focused instead on breathing slowly, steadily, the way he'd taught himself during those long years in hiding. The hearing room doors opened to reveal a wood-paneled chamber with high ceilings. Unlike a regular courtroom, this was a smaller, more intimate space. A semicircular table seated 5 stern-faced committee members, their nameplates gleaming under overhead lights. Behind them hung the American flag, its stars and stripes a silent witness to what was about to unfold. Eli took his seat at a solitary table facing the committee. His lawyer, a military attorney appointed by Harris, arranged papers beside him with efficient movements. The room smelled of leather and polish, wealth and power, so different from the honest simplicity of his food truck. Captain Eli Brooks, the committee chairman began, his voice filling the hushed room. You stand accused of falsifying federal documents and revealing classified information. How do you respond? Before Eli could speak, the doors opened again. Colonel Harris strode in, dress uniform pristine, ribbons catching the light. He carried a thick folder stamped with red classification marks. The chairman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Committee members," Harris said, his voice steady, but charged with purpose. "I request permission to present new evidence regarding Operation Sandstorm, 2014. A murmur rippled through the room. The chairman nodded slowly. Harris began methodically laying out documents, his testimony precise and devastating. These files prove that Captain Brooks received direct orders to maintain radio silence after the explosion. His presumed death was used to cover up unauthorized decisions made by then-General Marshall, who redirected air support for political purposes, leaving Brooks' team exposed. Photographs spilled across the table, satellite images, mission logs, decoded transmissions. Each piece added weight to Harris's words. Captain Brooks didn't desert. He protected classified intelligence by staying dark until he could ensure his daughter's safety. The real betrayal came from above. Eli sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table. He watched the committee members lean forward, examining documents, whispering among themselves. Their faces showed growing concern as the full picture emerged. When Harris finished, the chairman turned to Eli. "Captain Brooks, do you wish to make a statement?" Eli stood slowly, his voice quiet but clear. "Sir, I didn't come back for revenge. I came back to raise my daughter right." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Every day I serve meals to veterans who carry burdens heavier than mine. Every day I try to teach my little girl that doing what's right matters more than being right." He gestured to the documents spread before them. "Those papers show what happened, but they don't show what matters. What matters is that I'm still serving, not with a weapon anymore, but with a spatula and a smile. Because that's what this country needs. People who remember that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off." The chairman studied Eli for a long moment. "And the classified information? The story that's spreading online? Sir, I never sought attention. When those veterans recognized me, I had a choice: keep hiding or stand in truth. I chose truth. Because my daughter deserves to know her father isn't ashamed of who he is or what he did." The committee members conferred in hushed tones. Minutes stretched like hours as Eli remained standing, his heart beating steadily against his ribs. He thought of Maddie's smile, of Grace's unwavering faith, of his little food truck with its American flag snapping in the Tennessee breeze. Finally, the chairman looked up. "We'll need time to review all this evidence thoroughly. You're dismissed for now, Captain Brooks." Eli nodded once, military crisp, and turned toward the doors. As they opened, he saw them, Grace and Maddie, waiting in the hallway. His daughter's face lit up at the sight of him, though worry still creased her young brow. Grace stood beside her, elegant in a simple blue dress, her eyes full of quiet strength. A faint smile touched Eli's weary features as he crossed to them. Still, uncertain of what the committee would decide, he wrapped them both in a tight embrace, breathing in the scent of home and hope. The morning sun painted Washington, D.C. in shades of gold as news vans crowded the streets outside the Pentagon. On every channel and website, the headlines blazed: "Captain Eli Brooks cleared of all charges, declared a national hero." Phone notifications pinged across Maple Hollow as the story broke, and church bells rang spontaneously in celebration. Grace Thompson sat in her hotel room, tears streaming down her face as she watched the morning news coverage. Beside her, Maddie bounced on the bed, pointing at the TV screen every time her father's picture appeared. "Look, Miss Grace, they're telling everyone about Daddy." In the Pentagon briefing room, Colonel Harris stood at attention beside Eli, who wore his newly pressed dress uniform for the first time in years. The brass buttons gleamed under the lights as camera shutters clicked rapidly. Despite the media frenzy, Eli maintained the same quiet dignity that had characterized his years running the food truck. The United States military hereby formally acknowledges the extraordinary service and sacrifice of Captain Eli Brooks, the Pentagon spokesperson announced. His record has been fully reinstated, with additional commendations for valor under extreme duress. Reporters thrust microphones forward, shouting questions. Eli stepped to the podium, his hands steady but his eyes bright with emotion. "I'm grateful," he began simply, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used to greet customers at his truck. "Grateful to God for bringing me home. Grateful to my daughter Maddie for giving me reason to keep going. And grateful to everyone who believed in the truth." He paused, looking toward Grace and Maddie in the front row. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with faith and persistence. "I'm just a simple man who wanted to serve his country and raise his daughter right. That's all I've ever been." Colonel Harris stepped forward, presenting Eli with a formal document. His reinstatement papers. The cameras flashed as they shook hands. Brothers in arms reunited in honor rather than shadow. Later that afternoon, a small group gathered in a secured wing of the Pentagon. The honor wall stretched before them, its polished surface reflecting the soft overhead lights. Names of the fallen from classified missions lined the wall in precise rows, each letter etched with solemn dignity. A military craftsman carefully worked at one particular name. Capt. Eli Brooks. With precise movements, he affixed a golden star beside the engraving. Beneath it, new words appeared. "Returned with honor." Eli stood watching, Maddie's small hand clutched in his. Grace stood close by, her presence steady and warm as always. Colonel Harris completed the group, his usual military bearing softened by the weight of the moment. "Daddy," Maddie whispered, tugging at his hand. "Can I touch it?" Eli nodded, lifting her gently. She reached out, her small fingers tracing the letters of their shared name. The gold star sparkled under her touch, like a promise kept, like prayers answered. Harris cleared his throat. "It's not just a star, Maddie," he said softly. "It's a reminder that sometimes what looks like an ending is really a new beginning." Grace stepped closer, her hand finding Eli's free one. Together they stood before the wall in solemn silence, while Maddie smiled at her father's name, now finally fully restored to honor. The streets of Maple Hollow buzzed with activity as townspeople strung red, white, and blue bunting across Main Street. Children clutched tiny American flags, while their parents hung welcome home banners between the old maple trees. The morning air carried the sweet scent of fresh-baked pies cooling on windowsills and the sound of marching band practice drifting from the high school. Mayor Thompson, no relation to Grace, directed volunteers with enthusiasm. "Those flags need to be higher, Bill. And Sarah, make sure the Veterans Club has their spot marked right up front." His booming voice carried down the street as people scurried about with last-minute preparations. Grace Thompson and Maddie worked quietly behind the scenes, making sure Eli wouldn't suspect anything when they drove back into town. They had convinced him to take the long way home from Washington, claiming roadwork on the main highway. In reality, they needed time for the town to perfect their surprise. "Do you think Daddy will cry happy tears?" Maddie asked, as she helped Grace tie balloons to the courthouse railings. Her small hand struggled with the ribbon, but her face glowed with excitement. "I think your daddy might just be too happy for tears," Grace replied, giving the little girl a warm hug. She checked her watch. They should be hitting the county line any minute now. The town square had transformed into a sea of patriotic colors. Veterans from 3 counties stood at attention along the sidewalks, dress uniforms pressed and medals gleaming. The high school band took their position, brass instruments catching the morning sun. Colonel Harris and Sergeant Duke Wallace waited in Eli's freshly painted food truck. They had worked through the night with local mechanics to restore it, adding new equipment and a fresh coat of paint that made the Stars and Sandwiches logo shine. The small memorial photo inside had been professionally framed, with space beside it for Eli's reinstated medal. 5 minutes! Someone shouted, and a ripple of excitement ran through the crowd. Parents lifted small children onto their shoulders. Elderly veterans straightened their caps. The high school band director raised his baton. Grace and Maddie rushed to their designated spot as a police escort's lights appeared in the distance. The crowd fell silent, holding their collective breath. As Eli's truck rounded the corner, led by the police car, the band burst into God Bless America. Eli's truck stopped short as he took in the scene before him. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with emotion. Hundreds of faces smiled back at him, and the veterans along the sidewalk raised their hands in crisp salutes. Colonel Harris stepped forward, opening Eli's door. "Your chariot awaits, Captain Brooks," he said with a grin, gesturing to the restored food truck. Eli stepped out slowly, his eyes wide with disbelief. Maddie broke from Grace's side and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Welcome home, Daddy," she cried, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. Grace approached with dignity, though her eyes shimmered with tears. She handed both Eli and Maddie small American flags. "Your town would like to give you a proper welcome home," she said softly. The mayor stepped forward with a microphone. "Captain Eli Brooks." His voice boomed across the square. "Your town and your country welcome you back with pride and gratitude. Please take your rightful place and lead our parade." Eli climbed into his restored food truck, Maddie and Grace joining him in the cabin. Colonel Harris had thoughtfully installed an extra bench seat. As they began to move forward, the crowd erupted in cheers. The band struck up "Stars and Stripes Forever," and children ran alongside the truck, waving their flags. Veterans along the route snapped to attention, offering sharp salutes as Eli passed. Old Mrs. Jenkins, whose son had never returned from Vietnam, threw roses in the truck's path. The Korean War veterans from the VFW stood together, their weathered faces wet with tears of joy. The truck wound through the streets of Maple Hollow, past the church where Eli had finally found the courage to step into the light, past the school where Maddie would now walk proudly as a hero's daughter, past the diner, where he and Grace had shared so many quiet conversations. When they returned to the town square, Eli saw that his regular parking spot had been transformed. A new sign read, "Stars and Sandwiches, home of Captain Eli Brooks, serving heroes daily." The crowd gathered as Eli stepped down from the truck. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice strong and clear. "From today forward, half of all Stars and Sandwiches profits will go directly to veteran housing and support programs." The crowd cheered as he continued. "No warrior should ever have to fight alone or come home to silence." Grace squeezed his hand as people lined up at the truck. Eli insisted on serving that day himself, working alongside his new teenage employees. Each veteran who approached received not just a sandwich, but a moment of genuine connection with a brother in arms who understood their journey. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the square, Eli kept the truck open. Word had spread to the homeless shelter, and people began arriving, veterans who had lost their way, families down on their luck. Eli served them all with the same dignity and respect he showed to everyone else. Inside the truck, his newly restored medal hung proudly beside the photo of his fallen brothers. The small light above it seemed to make both glow, a testament to sacrifice and redemption. Each time Eli glanced at it while preparing food, it reminded him not of what he had lost, but of what he had regained: his honor, his place in the world, and most importantly, the chance to live openly as the father Maddie deserved. Through the service window, he could see Grace helping Maddie distribute napkins and drinks to the waiting people. The setting sun painted the scene in warm hues, transforming the simple act of serving food into something sacred, a communion of hearts, a sharing of hope, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal in the light of love and truth. The evening sun cast long shadows across the food truck park as crickets began their nightly symphony. The warm glow from Stars and Sandwich's windows spilled onto the wooden picnic table where Eli Brooks sat with his daughter Maddie and Grace Thompson. Paper plates with remnants of barbecue sauce testified to another successful dinner, but tonight wasn't about business. And then Tommy said the frog jumped right into Mrs. Peterson's coffee. Maddie giggled, nearly knocking over her lemonade as she acted out the story from school. Grace steadied the cup with a gentle hand, her eyes twinkling. "Careful there, sweetie." She shared a warm glance with Eli, who hadn't stopped smiling all evening. "That poor frog." Eli chuckled, wiping his hands on a napkin. "Bet he won't try that again." The easy laughter between them felt natural now, like a balm healing old wounds. Gone was the weight of secrets that had once hung heavy over their meals. Instead, the air carried hope and possibility. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "Speaking of jumping into things," she said, sliding it across the table to Eli. "I've been working on something I'd like to share with you both." Eli opened the folder, his expression curious as he studied the papers inside. "Grace's Kitchen for Veterans." He read aloud, his voice softening with understanding. "It's still in the planning stages," Grace explained, leaning forward. "But with your experience and my connections through the church." She paused, watching his face. "I thought maybe we could partner. Turn this into something bigger than just meals. Make it a place of healing." Maddie bounced in her seat. "Like when Daddy lets veterans eat free on Thursdays?" "Exactly like that, sweetheart." Grace nodded. "But every day, with counseling services and job training too." Eli studied the business plan, his fingers tracing the proposed layout. "This is incredible, Grace. You've thought of everything." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I'd be honored to help." Before Grace could respond, the crunch of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Colonel Harris emerged from his truck, looking relaxed in civilian clothes, a rare sight. "Hope I'm not interrupting dinner," he said, approaching their table. "Colonel." Maddie jumped up to hug him, an action that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Harris had become a regular fixture in their lives since the hearing, his stern military bearing softening around the young girl. "Just finished, actually." Eli stood to shake his hand. "Join us for coffee?" Harris settled onto the bench, accepting a steaming cup from Grace. "Got some news to share," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Turned in my retirement papers this morning." A moment of surprised silence fell over the table. Eli studied his old commander's face. "You sure about this, sir?" Harris nodded, a peaceful expression settling over his features. 28 years is enough, Captain. Time to let the next generation take the wheel." He took a sip of coffee. "Besides, what better way to end a career than by seeing justice done?" "What will you do now?" Grace asked, genuine concern in her voice. "Oh, I've got plans." Harris smiled mysteriously. "Maybe even some that involve this new kitchen project of yours, if you'll have an old soldier's help." While the adults talked, Maddie had pulled her coloring supplies from her backpack. Her small hands moved purposefully across the paper, tongue stuck out in concentration. The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on plans for the kitchen, Harris's retirement ceremony, and the upcoming town festival. As the sky deepened to purple, Maddie finally sat up straight, her masterpiece complete. "Daddy," she said, holding the paper carefully, "I made this for you." Eli accepted the drawing, and his breath caught slightly. There on the paper was their food truck, drawn with a child's loving detail. But it was the figures standing in front that made his heart swell. Himself in his apron, Maddie holding his hand, and Grace standing close beside them, all wearing bright crayon smiles. "Our family," Maddie explained simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Grace's eyes glistened as she looked at the drawing, and even Harris cleared his throat gruffly. Eli pulled his daughter into a tight hug, unable to speak for a moment. "It's perfect, sweetheart," he finally managed. "Absolutely perfect." As the evening wrapped up, Harris stood to leave, pausing to place a hand on Eli's shoulder. "You made us all proud, Captain," he said quietly. "Never forget that." Later that night, after Grace had headed home with promises to discuss more kitchen plans tomorrow, Eli followed his usual bedtime routine with Maddie. He tucked the blankets around her, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Daddy?" Her voice was sleepy but determined. "Yes, baby? You're my hero," she whispered, her eyes already drifting closed. Eli leaned down to kiss her forehead, his voice thick with emotion. "No, sweetheart. You're mine." The first rays of sunlight painted the Tennessee sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Maple Hollow. The air held that perfect stillness that only comes in the moments before a town awakens, when the world feels full of possibilities and God's presence seems to whisper through every breeze. Eli Brooks stood beside his food truck, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, feeling the warmth seep through the ceramic and into his palms. The morning air carried the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms and the promise of another beautiful day, mixed with the faint aroma of fresh bread drifting from the bakery across the street. The freshly painted words on his truck gleamed in the early light. "Stars and sandwiches, served with honor." Each letter seemed to hold a piece of his journey, from the darkness of secrets and shame, back into the brilliant light of truth and acceptance. The paint was still so new that it caught the morning sun like a beacon, announcing to the world what he'd spent so many years hiding. The American flag above the serving window fluttered softly in the morning breeze, its stars and stripes a reminder of everything he'd fought for overseas, everything he'd lost in the shadows, and everything he'd found again in this small Tennessee town that had embraced him as family. The sound of familiar footsteps drew near, their gentle rhythm as comforting as a hymn. Eli turned to see Grace Thompson approaching along the sidewalk, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee from Martha's Diner, steam rising from the lids like tiny prayers ascending to heaven. Her warm smile brightened the dawn even more than the rising sun, and Eli felt that familiar flutter in his chest, the same one that reminded him his heart was still capable of love after loss. "Thought you might need a refill," she said, trading his empty cup for a full one. Her fingers brushed his for just a moment, warm and gentle. "You're out here awful early today, even for you." "Just feeling grateful," Eli replied, his voice soft with emotion. He took a sip of the fresh coffee, tasting not just the rich roast but the kindness behind the gesture. "Sometimes I still can't believe how everything turned out. After all those years of running from the truth, here I am, standing in it." Grace stood beside him, their shoulders barely touching, as they watched the town come to life. The bakery across the street was raising its metal shutters with a familiar clatter, and old Mr. Wilson was already sweeping his sidewalk with the same methodical strokes, same as he did every morning at exactly 6:30. Mrs. Patterson's cat stretched lazily on her front porch, and the morning paper delivery truck rumbled quietly down Elm Street. "The Lord has his ways," Grace said, sipping her coffee and watching a cardinal land on the maple tree that gave their town its name, "even when we can't see the path ahead. Even when we think we're walking through the valley alone, He's always preparing something beautiful on the other side." A weathered pickup truck rumbled down Main Street, its engine making that particular sound that spoke of hard work and honest miles. 3 veterans climbed out, their movements still carrying that unmistakable military bearing even in civilian clothes. Eli recognized them from the shelter, men who'd found their way back from their own dark places, battles fought both overseas and in their own hearts. They were regulars now, part of the morning rhythm that had become as precious to Eli as breathing. "Morning, Captain," the oldest one called out, touching his baseball cap in respect. His name was Pete, and he'd served 2 tours in Iraq before finding his way to Maple Hollow. The others nodded their greetings. Tommy, who still walked with a slight limp from an IED blast, and David, whose quiet eyes held stories he wasn't ready to tell. Eli nodded warmly, feeling the familiar swell of brotherhood that connected them across years and miles and different wars. "Breakfast is almost ready, gentlemen. Give me 5 minutes to fire up the grill. Coffee's fresh if you want to pour yourselves some while you wait." Inside the truck, Eli moved with practiced ease, his hands finding spatulas and switches without conscious thought. The familiar routine grounded him, connecting him to this new life he'd built from the ashes of his old one. The familiar sizzle of the grill filled the air. As he laid out strips of bacon, the sound as comforting as a lullaby. Grace stepped inside to help, their movements synchronized after months of working side by side, each knowing exactly what the other needed without words. She handed him the eggs from the small refrigerator, their fingers touching briefly in the exchange. "Pete's wife called yesterday," she said quietly. "She wanted to thank you again for hiring him part-time to help with the weekend catering. Says it's given him purpose again." "He's earned it," Eli replied, cracking eggs onto the grill with careful precision. Good men just need good chances. The veterans waited patiently at one of the picnic tables Eli had added last month, sharing quiet conversation about their families, their jobs, their small victories and daily struggles. Their voices carried the easy camaraderie of men who understood each other's battles without explanation. When their breakfast sandwiches were ready, Eli served them himself, each wrapped in paper printed with small American flags, a detail that Grace had suggested and that never failed to bring a smile to their faces. "Thank you for your service," Eli said to each man as he handed over their meal, meaning it more deeply than most could understand. These words, which he'd heard countless times himself, now carried the weight of his own journey home. The men stood as one, and one by one, they offered crisp salutes before taking their seats. The gesture still humbled Eli every time, a reminder that respect and honor weren't lost in the darkness he'd walked through. They were waiting for him when he found the courage to step back into the light. He'd gone from hiding his service like a shameful secret to wearing it openly, like a badge of healing rather than a burden of guilt. The morning grew brighter, painting the town square in shades of gold and amber. The sound of running feet announced Maddie's arrival before she came into view. She bounded across the park from the direction of Grace's house, where she'd spent the night for their weekly sleepover. Her backpack bouncing with each step, and a small American flag clutched in her hand. Her laughter rang out like bells in the morning air, pure and joyful in the way that only children could manage. "Daddy, Miss Grace," she called, waving her flag enthusiastically. "Look what we're using for show and tell today." Eli caught her in a hug, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around once before setting her down. The simple gesture filled him with more happiness than any medal or commendation ever could. "And what are you going to tell your class about that flag, sweetheart?" "That it stands for brave people," Maddie declared proudly. Her chin lifted with the confidence that had grown stronger each day since the truth came out. "Like you, Daddy. And that sometimes heroes come back home to make sandwiches and help other people remember they're not alone." Grace laughed, the sound warm and genuine as she reached out to straighten Maddie's slightly crooked ponytail. "That's exactly right, honey. And sometimes they come back to remind us all what really matters. Family, community, and taking care of each other." Eli set Maddie down and watched her skip over to greet the veterans, who welcomed her with warm smiles and gentle teasing about whether she'd grown another inch since yesterday. His daughter had grown so much in these past months, not just in height, but in understanding and confidence. She carried herself with a new pride now, secure in who she was and where she came from, no longer burdened by the weight of secrets or the fear of discovery. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air and catching the metallic gleam of Eli's service medal, now displayed proudly inside the truck's front window where everyone could see it. Beside it hung two photographs in simple frames. One of his old unit taken before everything went wrong, young faces full of hope and determination, and one taken just last month of him, Maddie, and Grace, at the Veterans fundraiser they'd organized together. In the newer photo, all three of them were laughing, flour somehow dusted across their faces from the marathon of sandwich making that had fed 200 people. Looking at those images side by side, past and present, loss and redemption, Eli felt the familiar wave of gratitude wash over him like warm sunlight. He remembered the fear that had gripped him for so long, the crushing weight of secrets and silence that had nearly broken him, the sleepless nights wondering if he'd ever be able to tell his daughter the truth about who he really was. But he also remembered the grace that had carried him through, the unwavering support of his community, the strength of his daughter's unconditional love, and the steady faith that had led him back into the light when he'd been certain he was lost forever. The morning bustle of Maple Hollow surrounded them now, cars passing with friendly honks and waves, shopkeepers greeting each other by name across the street, school buses beginning their routes with their cargo of chattering children. It was the peaceful rhythm of small-town life that Eli had once feared he'd lose forever when the truth came out. Instead, he'd found it again, deeper and richer than before, seasoned with the understanding that came from walking through fire and emerging whole. The veterans finished their breakfast and gathered their things, folding their napkins neatly and stacking their plates with the automatic precision of military training that never quite fades. As they passed by the truck, they paused to shake Eli's hand, each grip firm and meaningful. Their eyes held the understanding that only fellow soldiers could share. The knowledge of darkness overcome, of brotherhood restored, of honor reclaimed not through grand gestures, but through quiet daily choices to keep serving others. Maddie hugged her father once more before heading off to school, her little flag still waving as she skipped toward the yellow bus that was just pulling up to the corner. Grace touched Eli's arm gently, a gesture of comfort and connection that had become as natural as breathing, before going to serve another customer who just arrived, Mrs. Rodriguez from the grocery store, looking for her usual coffee and egg sandwich before opening her shop. The morning sun had fully risen now, bathing everything in clear, golden light that seemed to illuminate not just the physical world, but something deeper, the possibilities that each new day brought, the chances for grace and kindness, and small acts of heroism that made all the difference. Eli looked up at the brightening sky, his heart full of a peace that surpassed understanding. The words came to him, as they often did these days, not as a burden, but as a promise. "Sometimes God brings you back," he whispered to the morning air, "not to prove you lived, but to show you still have work to do." Above him, the sun continued its eternal journey across the heavens, bright and unwavering, lighting the way forward into another blessed day, full of sandwiches to make, stories to share, and hearts to heal, including his own. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Eli Brooks, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.